David, The Shooting Salvationist is a story about a notorious pastor from the Fort Worth area in Texas. And as a pastor yourself, what led you to want to focus on such a controversial story for the book?
That's a really good question because as a pastor, people have asked me, what's the deal with this? Are you trying to, air the dirty linen, of Christianity, which of course is not the case. Who better to write about the flaws of a pastor than a pastor? I think it also speaks to the issue of putting people on a pedestal, whether they're pastors or people that are stars in media or entertainment or the political world, what I would call the cult of personality. But also, I think, because I know a little bit about the Bible, not every character in the Bible is presented without flaws. In fact, most of the characters are presented flaws and all, and we learn from their good things and their mistakes. And I think, therefore, The Shooting Salvationist and Dr. J. Frank Norris of Fort Worth is in many ways a cautionary tale.
A cautionary tale indeed, but a fascinating one at that. And when and how did you learn about J. Frank Norris and the story itself?
Well, it's very interesting because this story has sort of been buzzing in my head even from when I was a teenager. Because Norris had a national following and ministry, and for a period of time in the 1940s, during and shortly after World War II, my grandparents attended a church where he regularly spoke. And my mother, as a young girl, did. So I heard these stories growing up about this strange preacher who his church buildings burned down mysteriously. He was indicted several times. And then he shot a guy and was charged with murder and faced the Texas death penalty. So it's a fascinating story. And I really have gathered stuff over the years, and finally a few years ago I decided to pursue the project in earnest.
So this is a story you've known about for a long time, but it was only recently that you decided you wanted to write about this and explain this tale so that the world could see it.
Yeah, and that process took a lot of research because I wanted to tell it in a way that was factual, that was thoroughly detailed, but also compelling. And so I had to make a commitment at some point, and I did this about 2007, to take the files that I developed that eventually became 6,000 pages of court records and newspapers and articles and references in books and so forth, and categorize them and put them into some kind of order so I could write this narrative.
Now talk about a little more of the research process itself. Did you talk with people who were connected with the story? Did you travel to Texas? Did you visit the sites that are mentioned in the book?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Texas. I'm not from Texas. I'm from Michigan originally, and I've spent most of my career on the East Coast, New York, and now the Washington, D.C. area. But I spent a lot of time in Fort Worth, Texas, which is where the story took place in the 1920s, in their libraries, at the University of Texas at Arlington as well, in their archives, and I made several trips, and I actually walked the city streets, downtown Fort Worth, because even though the buildings are different now from what they were in 1926, I got a feel from walking as to where this person was and where that person was. And it was a fascinating process. I really fell in love in many ways with that particular region and have great respect. And there's a lot of the history of that city, and not just that city, but America in the 1920s, which I think the more I dug into it is an endlessly fascinating era.
So you visited the city recently, but can you talk about the city in the 1920s, the era that this story took place in? The Ku Klux Klan was there. I mean, Prohibition was existed.
Right.
Times have changed. Can you talk about the similarities or the differences between now and then and how that impacted the story?
Yeah, I think it's a very different place now. It's a much more cosmopolitan, metropolitan kind of era. In the 1920s, there was still a little bit of the feel of the Old West with its sort of wildness. In the 20s, you had Prohibition, you had a lot of crime, and you had the Ku Klux Klan. And in Texas, as well as many other states in the Union, they were for a bit, for a little while, a powerful force in politics. There was even a U.S. senator from Texas elected largely with Klan backing, named Mayfield, back in the early 20s. And there was a while where you couldn't be elected dog catcher without that backing. That ended, and it was only for a few years that took place. But this story weaves that in because the Klan was a very much, of course, racist organization, anti-Semitic organization, but also one of the things about the 1920s Klan, particularly in the South, it was also strongly anti-Catholic. And to a Protestant Baptist preacher like J. Frank Norris, who was a real demagogue in many ways. That was the issue that resonated with him. And I don't know that it's ever been proved or can be proven that he was ever an official member of the Klan, but he advertised the Klan in his newspaper that he published, and the Grand Dragon of the local Fort Worth Klan attended his church and eventually joined the staff of his church. So there's a lot of strange bedfellows there.
Sounds like it. Now, with this book, who do you think will be the primary audience? Do you think it will be people of faith? Will it have significant following in Texas? Do you believe it's a nationwide or even an international appeal?
It's a great question. I think that it's not a faith book. It's a story. It's a tell me a story. It's a great narrative, I think, from a compelling period of time. There are certainly things in it that will resonate with people of faith. There are also things that will make sometimes people of faith uncomfortable, like, why is he digging into this? It's going to make everybody of faith look bad. It doesn't have to, but I think some are going to be uncomfortable with it. There will be people who are anti-faith, who will find fodder in this, that they'll seize on something and it'll prove their caricature. And so I think there's that much. True crime, it's a history, and it reads like a novel, but everything is factual. Everything in quotes in the book comes from a published document, a newspaper, a court record. No dialogue has been invented, stayed very faithful to that narrative form.
Well, it sounds like a very compelling story. It may make for a great movie someday.
It would. I'd love that to happen.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about some authors that you find yourself stylistically similar to or you use as inspiration?
Yeah, I'd hesitate to call myself stylistically similar to this author, but probably my hero in this genre is Erik Larson. Thunderstruck, Devil in White City, Isaac Storm, and now in the Garden of the Beasts, which is a story that's just recently out, juxtaposing what was going on in Berlin in 1933 with the arrival of the new U.S. ambassador. He is the master, in my opinion, of narrative nonfiction. There are other people. Of course, the genre goes back to In Cold Blood with Truman Capote, who made the first real popular one. But Larson, I'm not in his league, but he is certainly an inspiration. In fact, recently reading his new book reminded me of when I was a kid learning to play the trumpet, and I first heard Al Hirt play, and I decided I'll never play the trumpet again. When I read Erik Larson's prose, it really inspires me, but also discourages me because he is so good.
Well, I think he'd be happy to hear that, to say the least. And finally, what does it mean to you to have CBS News' Bob Schieffer, a Fort Worth native himself, writing the foreword for this?
It's great. Bob loves Fort Worth. He loves history. He's familiar with the J. Frank Norris story, as are all people who have a long-time relationship with Fort Worth, Texas. And it means a lot. I think it means a lot for opening some doors for the book, but it also means a lot that somebody of his stature has taken the time to do this. He's been very gracious throughout the process, and I think his foreword, quite frankly, not just because of him, but what he wrote, adds an awful lot to the book.
Great. Well, David, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Rob.